the cloud. I'm going to stop sharing and leave the floor for you and Ben.
Thanks a lot, Harshika. Okay, folks, so now I would like all of you to put your hands together for Ben Maynard. Ben has coached, trained, and been passionate about software and people for more than a decade now. He's passionate about organizational culture and design that enables the certain creation of value, both for an organization, customers, and its people. He's always curious to ask these two questions. Are we building the right product? Are we building it the right way? So today, he's going to tell us a little bit about the leaders in the new relationship. So the rate and scale of change has both enforced people, team, and organization to go through a lot of change in the last 18 months. And it is just very invigorating to see how these changes have come about, which we would have never anticipated in the last 100 years. And also when we think of leadership these days, right? So now leadership has a lot of different challenges that have emerged. So this would definitely require all of us, even if we care to admit or not, that we have to grow and nurture new types of relationship through exercising new skills in the relationship building area, which is long overdue. So I will hand it over to Ben to talk about the leader's new relationship. Ben, over to you.
Well, thank you very much. I'm assuming you can hear me okay?
We can.
Excellent. Lots of noise on the case. Well, thank you very much for having me. Let me just do a few things. Well, before I share my screen, the one thing that I just wanted to say is that this, whilst I was preparing for this talk, I had some news about someone who I feel very lucky to have been able to call my friend, but she unfortunately passed away like far too young last week, and it's affected a lot of us. So I dedicate this talk to Priya and for all of the, I don't know, all the difference that she made, because the one thing that I learned, I think more from her in particular, which is working in large corporates as I have done for many years, you don't come across a huge number of like really kind of honest people. As she would have said it, people with a clean heart, and she was absolutely one of them. So this talk that I'm about to give is from the heart. It may be a bit rough around the edges because I've made some last minute changes based upon what happened, but Priya, this one's for you. So let me share my screen and make a little tweak here. Lovely. Okay, so I want to talk about the new types of relationships that leaders are going to have to build over the next, over the coming years. I kind of feel that as a global community, there's a new dawn, and I think what leaders are going to have to do, and kind of put agile to one side of this, I take this as broadly as possible, is that they have to begin to see whole people. Not just a role or not just some transactions or some metrics, or dare I say it, a resource, but actually see people as whole people. And during this talk, I want to go over just what that means. I'm going to talk about perhaps how relationships have been and how organizations tend to view things, and give some tips and some advice as we go along. So, first, a note on my personal opinions of leadership. Now, it was a gentleman called Craig Larman who said something to me many years ago about how he'd only ever met a handful of what he would call true leaders in all of his time in software delivery. And I didn't really get that comment. I mean, it confused me somewhat, and it confused me for a good few years. It wasn't until I read a book by a gentleman named Dee Hock about the rise of Visa, the credit and debit card organization, that I began to truly understand it. And it changed my opinions on leadership. And so before we begin, I just want to start on the note saying that leadership isn't when people are obligated to follow you. This isn't when you join an organization and you're put in some kind of hierarchy or structure and then you are obliged to follow someone. Leadership is when people choose to follow you. And leadership is about doing new and better things and people still choosing to follow you. That's what leadership is to me. And that's what Craig meant, I believe, when he said to me he's only met a few. because there's only been a handful of people that I've met in my long and tenuous career who I would say I've actually wanted to choose to follow, and I would have followed them wherever they went. And so that's what I mean when I say leadership in this respect. It's when people choosing to follow you. And I think that what I'll go over in the next kind of 25 minutes or so will help to kind of hammer that home a little bit. So I could start with a really predictable opener, last 18 months, etc., etc. I mean, these have been terrible times for everyone. And whilst it's getting better for some, it's getting worse for many, many more. And we are faced with a number of challenges. Right? So I'm not going to start with the predictable one, right? But I'm going to start by saying that the last 18 months have changed the way that leaders are going to have to view, build, and nurture relationships, not only their one-to-one relationships with the people that work with them, but the organizations in the relationships across the whole organization, if people are going to choose to follow them rather than being obligated. Because the virus, as awful, tremendously awful as it's been, it's also, and I'm seeing this, particularly I'm seeing this in the UK, I'm also seeing it in other regions as well, it's beginning to level the playing field. This, I hate to say it, but there's a great quote from McKinsey, which you'll see on the screen now, which is basically saying the virus has broken through cultural and technological barriers. It's leveled the playing field for some, not for all. Not for all. I mean, we're talking here knowledge workers. If you are a sanitation worker, if you're a chef, if you're caring for people, like, your lives, unfortunately, have probably changed for the worse. And maybe you haven't been given a whole heap of extra opportunities. For those of us that work in knowledge working environments, we are experiencing a greater breadth of opportunity. It doesn't matter anymore where you're based geographically. You can go for jobs in different locations. What I'm also seeing quite a huge amount of in the UK is the amount of money which people are getting paid is beginning to, I suppose I'd use the words homogenize, i.e. be blended. So no longer is there like particular areas of the UK where you earn twice as much for, say, being a coach, for example. Actually, those prices are beginning to level out, because you can live up in the north of the country and get a job down in the south, because it's so much of it is remote. And because of this, we find that people are getting paid more fairly. Right? Some of the discrepancies that we've seen historically are going away. The cost for agile courses, for example, I think I've seen some fantastic suppliers of training from India, break into the UK markets and bring the price down. That's only a positive thing. So in essence, what we're seeing here is that people are having more choices. They're able to get jobs in locations they couldn't do before. As a consequence, all the diversity, the cultural diversity, and the breadth and the depth of that diversity is increasing quite significantly in organizations. So whilst on one hand, we have perhaps some more freedom, we have remote working, which means more flexibility for people, which means that people maybe don't want to work core hours, people working for different types of organizations in different regions or different countries. All that's really positive, and in essence, it's leveling the playing field. And with that, from an organizational perspective, comes a huge amount of challenge for leaders, because the way that they've led historically perhaps isn't going to be as relevant. So as a consequence of all of this, right, as a consequence of the cultural diversity of an organization changing, because we are getting different people from different locations with different histories, people wanting more flexibilities, I believe leaders are going to need to get more personal. Well, I think this has always been the case, but I think now it's amplified. So let me kind of set the scene of why I think things need to change. So much of leadership, and to probably a lesser, well, an equal or greater extent, management, has been based upon the idea that this kind of behaviourist psychology perspective, that it's about stimulus and response. It's about carrot and stick. That we can, if in order to get people to do things, we need to in some way stimulate them to do something. We need to make it worth their while. We need to incentivize them. And this kind of idea of cause and effect, if I was working in an office and somebody said, put in a new metric to try and make people work harder, then they could see that they're working harder. They could observe that. They could see what effect that measurement was having. But now we're working remotely. That isn't really the case. Right? So this kind of behaviourist stimulus and response, carrot and stick style approach to leadership, thinking that we can just incentivize everything in some way, and we'll get the standard response. And I think has always been somewhat broken. And I think it's more broken now than ever. Because one, this idea is the same way we train dogs, right? And we're not dogs being taught how to sit. We're more than that. We're whole people. And right now in the world, we've got a lot more going on than just the office. This behaviorist perspective of leadership is very deterministic. It treats humans as very predictable entities of cause and effect. So if I do this, then I get this. If I click my fingers and say sit, the human sits, and then I reward the human for sitting, and then they will get back up, and I click my fingers again and say sit, and they'll do the same. Humans aren't quite as deterministic as that. It isn't quite that straightforward. And because of everything that's going on in the world now, people are distracted. Right? People need a bit of flexibility. Right? And what you think maybe the type of, you think you're going to get one response isn't the case. I mean, I saw this quite significantly when I was working remotely. We had a number of teams based up in Delhi, and I was based in London, and I was doing my best to support them from London. But every time we would try and run an experiment and do something, and we all agreed to it, I'd then talk to them the next day or the day after and find out that actually the response was very different. And that all it was is because I couldn't be there with them. I couldn't see what was going on. I couldn't see the influence of other leaders and managers was having on the people and making them change their behaviors. And now, because so many of us are remote, observing and understanding the responses to the types of measures, constraints, etc. we put in organizations is much harder. And ironically, what we're seeing is in some organizations, because we don't know what effect some of the things we're doing is having, we put in yet more mechanical mechanisms to try and understand what's happening, more metrics, and we just slowly grind people down. But because perhaps there is now more freedom to move around, and people are able to look more broadly at where to work, people aren't going to stick around if we continue to behave in this way. And I'm not saying this is new, this has always been the case, but I feel that now more than ever, this approach is beginning to really strain. And whilst it has some benefits, I don't think it's the way we should move forward. Now, this behaviourist approach is very similar to what is known as Theory X and Theory Y. And Theory X is all about the incentives. It's all about rewards and punishments for doing things. Right? So as a leader, you would set rewards if they do something good and punishments for if they don't. And to a certain extent, little bits of this perhaps can, in a broad soup of leadership, can have their place. However, this approach, this Theory X approach, doesn't see the whole human. Right? All we're seeing is some behaviours, and I don't think because of that it's really got much of a place. Now, I found this book, Humble Leadership, around the beginning of the pandemic, and I must say that it's one of the most it's one of the books that's changed my opinion on so much of my life and my professional career. And the main thing I took away from this book was this idea of different levels of relationship that we can build. And what I discovered through reading the book was by Edgar and Peter Schein is that the way that we have been working doesn't work well in knowledge working environments, doesn't work well to create psychological safety. And whilst I think a lot of us know this already, what was fantastic about this book is that it put labels to things and put a great deal of effort into really explaining the different levels of relationship, what it means for organizations and what we can do to change. So I'm going to go over 3 of the levels. Now, the first level, which I'll give a bit more detail on in a minute, is level 0. Okay, so we don't even start with level -1. We don't even start at 0. We start at the very, very early on. And with this very low level of relationship, probably the worst type of relationship, which hasn't got any type of you should never find in a democratic society, is all about control. Okay, so controlling isn't leadership. Management isn't leadership. Right? Leadership is leadership. And with leadership, you have to understand that the people aren't working for you, you are working for the people, as D. Hock said. And when we look at this level -1 type of relationship, right, this is total impersonal domination and coercion. Right? This is cold and it's unnecessary. This is threatening to report people to I mean, the greatest example I found of this was when you look at illegal immigrants in America being forced to work in horrific conditions. But the people that kind of run the companies, the people that employ them, say, well, if you report us for these horrific conditions, then what we're going to do is we're going to report you to the authorities, so you get deported. So they are forcing people to work against their will. They have no say. They are not seen as humans. They're barely even seen as resources. They are seen as the lowest of the low. And this total impersonal domination and coercion, I hope that no one's ever experienced in the professional environment. And this has no place. Okay, so we don't want to start there. Right. Actually, what we find is level 1 relationships, right, is what we find in most organizations. Okay, so this is a level above. And these types of level 1 relationships, this is what we find naturally occurs when people implement a hierarchy for some reason, right? So if you've ever been in a situation where someone says the reason that people aren't doing their job is because the role description isn't tight enough, or people don't understand their role, or all we need to do is write a role description so people know what they're doing, right? That's all level 1. It's very transactional, it's very rule-based. It is effectively saying that your job is what is written down. There's no level of person. You're not getting to know the person. You're seeing them as a resource. You're seeing people as a commodity. And as a consequence, what we end up seeing is that people end up begin to get very competitive as individuals. They don't want to work as teams, because it's all about them executing their role. There is no benefit in a level 1 relationship for you to cooperate with anyone ordinarily, because it's all about how well you're executing your role. Now, these types of relationships do have a place. So if you take professional coaching, for example, professional coaching is one of these types of relationships, because you have to maintain a certain professional air. You're not looking to become friends with someone if you're coaching them. You are a professional and you're looking to help them. Same as if you're a counselor or a lawyer or a doctor. You're not there to make friends with the person. There are certain rules and ethics and boundaries that you operate within. So for those types of relationships, this is fine. This is fine. But when we're in situations where we need to make the most of people's potential, we need people to speak freely, we need people to cooperate. Right? We're employing people because of their intelligence. And most importantly, given everything that's happening in the world right now and everything that has happened, right, with people needing flexibility, with people grieving because they've lost loved ones, right, what we don't need are people coming in and trying to get people to stick to their role anymore. We need flexibility. We need people to be whole. And we need people to be respected as whole people if we're going to find ways to solve increasingly complex problems in this kind of, I would love to say post-COVID world, but I don't think we're quite at that point yet. Now, the interesting thing about this is that these are predominantly, in all my career, working at many big banks and many of the clients I've worked with, that this type of relationship is basically what you see in leadership. And often it works really well when you have a very charismatic, very visionary leader who is enough to break through the apathy and the resistance of the people. And I know that I've been there. I'm stuck in organizations because I thought the world of the leader, because I believed in their vision, not because I enjoyed the job and not particularly because I enjoyed my role, but that person's vision and their energy was enough to keep me going through to a point. And then I voted with my feet. So we have a case for change, right? These types of relationships, these level 1 relationships, are impersonal, they are role-based, and they are rigid. They don't deal with complexity very well, right? And these types of relationships in isolation can't cope with the relationships that are required to be built and the way that we are going to have to work in the future, because we know that if we work together, we can achieve greater things than if we work as individuals. Right? People desire and demand flexibility. Level 1 relationships allow less for that because you're not concerned about the person. You're just seeing them as a resource, as a number on a spreadsheet. You probably don't care too much about what's going on in their personal life. People need time to grieve and cope with a change in work and social values, and level 1 relationships struggle to flex to this. And as I mentioned earlier, complexity is increasing exponentially. And to deal with this, we need people to speak their minds, take initiative, and solve problems in increasingly better ways. And if you're stuck in your box, if you're stuck in your role, right, then unless all of the roles are intricately designed and done in such a way where it makes it individually beneficial to cooperate, people aren't going to do it. And the problem is with hierarchical organizations, everyone's stuck in a silo, everyone's optimizing their piece. No one's trying to optimize the whole. And level one relationships are designed to not only maintain, but also to increase that style of organization and leadership. So my proposal is that leaders and managers need to build new relationships with a more humanist approach. So seeing people as whole humans, taking into account everything. Okay, so taking into account what happens in between work, right? Understanding what the people have got going on in their personal life and making judgment calls and making allowances for that. It means being empathetic. It means about having accurate empathetic understanding, to have unconditional positive regard for your people, and listen so that you can begin to create psychological safety. The humanist approach here, that comes from psychology, was a rally against the behaviorist psychology approach, right? Because behaviorist psychology was very much focused on the behaviors. Humanist approach was focused on the whole human, and the humanist approach is much more aligned to something like systems thinking, because we're taking into account a much broader range of things and seeing people as whole people, not just resources. It emphasizes personal worth of the individual. It focuses on human values, creativity, and the very essence of what it is to be a human. Right? It's a very optimistic approach, and we're there to make things better. The humanist approach is there to make the whole system better, not just little point behaviors. And right now we need systemic improvements, not little local tweaks here and there. So what I'm building up to is that there is another level of relationship in the book, Humble Leadership, where it is all about building those more personal connections. And what we don't want is teammates that nod when we nod, because our shadows do a much better job than that. What we need is level 2 relationships, personal, cooperative, trusting relationships, like friendships and effective teams. But these are not friendships. Okay, we're not saying that leaders should go and make friends with everyone. But what I am saying is that people in an organization need to feel comfortable sharing what's on their mind. They need to be comfortable taking a level of risk and speaking openly. And we are much more willing and inclined to do that if we feel that that person sees us as a whole. That leaders should build level 2 relationships throughout the whole organization, build a meaningful network of these. Okay, and of course, there are only a certain number of social connections we can make at one time, and I'll bring up that in a second. But if we take this level 2 approach, we value whole people, we focus on collaboration, cooperation, and learning over individualism, then we can begin to better deal with this kind of changed world that we're now faced with and embrace this increased cultural diversity and breadth of people that we're going to be finding in organizations. Very important. It doesn't mean we have to be friends. It just means we need to feel comfortable to speak. As a little side note, the authors of the book Humble Leadership have worked very closely and are very tightly aligned with Amy Edmondson. So all of this relates to psychological safety. So what does this mean in practice? Okay, if you're a leader, what does level 2 mean? Well, first of all, it means you involve people in the design of some of your strategies, right? You canvas opinion. It doesn't mean that you do what they suggest, but you bring people on the journey, because research shows the more you involve people in the designing of a strategy, the more inclined they are to get behind it and help you implement it. I would also recommend for leaders that you study group dynamics. There is a book called Reading the Room, which is a fantastic book, which talks about the group dynamics in conversation, both in the work environment and in families, and teaches you how to deal with those group dynamics to better facilitate. And by having understanding of group dynamics, it means you can kind of move over those level 1 relationships and limit the damage from competitive individualism, get a more equal voice in the decision-making process. And you can further reduce competitive individualism by rotating members of the leadership team. Organizations will probably always be designed in such a way where you have these silos, but you can have to break some of that down and help people have more ownership of the whole by rotating the leadership around each of the different sections. So your head of engineering becomes your head of HR, and your head of HR becomes the head of the CTO department. Your CTO becomes head of engineering, and you keep rotating those on a basis so the whole organization becomes everyone's problem, not just little pieces of it. And by doing these things, you help to build better relationships and transcend that purely role-based transactional. Now, if you're going to ask me, well, how does a leader split their time and how do they go about doing this practically? I think around half the time, leaders should be spent focusing on working on themselves, their leadership styles, behaviors, and strategy. 20 to 30% of their time focus on working with their direct team and building strong level 2 relationships with their direct team. So you're setting a good role model and you're letting everybody know in your direct team how they should be behaving with their people. And the rest of the time, they should be practicing going to see people in the organization, making sure those types of relationships are being built and making yourself approachable, having people get to know you a little bit more.
Ben,
so, yes.
7 more minutes to go, and we might have a few questions as well.
Okay, let me get through 2 more things. I'll be quick. First of all, Dunbar's number has been consistently incorrectly applied in the Agile community. The idea of having organizations around 150 or so is a completely incorrect application of it. And to confirm this, I emailed Robin Dunbar and we had a conversation. And what he says is if we're going to build social connections, people that we may have a certain relationship where we are seen as friends, then what we need to do is, that's what we have 150 people for. Okay, but in the work environment, when actually it's more like 300 or 400 people we're going to be working with. So if we want to build meaningful relationships, we need to keep organizations small, but we have to appreciate that 150 people have already got 100 of those taken up in their personal life. So we need smaller, more focused organizations so that those relationships can be built. And there's a few tips, right? Leaders should focus on the interactions, create organizations that are leader full, and care less about role definitions and more about the interactions between people. So that's it, I'm done. Sorry for running over. I hope you've enjoyed it. That's me. There's some courses there and a discount code if you want it. Over to you. Any questions?
It was definitely amazing, Ben, and I know time is of an essence here, so we'll start taking the questions. We have Rupak with his hand raised. So Rupak, can you unmute yourself?
Yeah, hi. Can you hear me?
Yes.
There's some problem with video. I just stopped the video. So Ben, thank you. Thank you for sharing your amazing insights on the leadership. So I have just a few questions, right? Although we talk about leadership should change their ways of thinking and start thinking about relationship on a higher level, as you mentioned, right? But as we have seen, right, these industrial era practice from the scientific management from Taylor, which have been come to the IT system, which has been part of our organizational design day in and day out, right? So even managers are part of that system. So you get what you want, right? So if you take about the incentives structure we have, which promotes individualism, you have the organizational design. Just to cut the details short, right? How do you think the leadership can behave in a certain way without changing the basics of the organizational design, right? Because somewhere down the line, these leaders fit in that design.
Yeah, I think that some organizations are destined to never change. Right? I don't think some organizations will change, and it's depressing, perhaps a little bit, but I think sometimes, and you know, I kind of I glance at Sanjay when I say this because me and you had the pleasure of working with him a number of years ago. Some organizations I don't think will ever change, right? But you do find, I think there is a strong element of having a great leader which can change the behaviors, and what those strong leaders, if they really want to change the organization, you have to expect a certain level of attrition. Right, and I think this is one thing. Go on, Rupak.
Yes, sorry. The way I'm seeing it, right, because this scientific management, it caught up because they presented evidence that manufacturing is shooting up if you do that, right? So is there a need of starting something to provide evidence-based that this is the new thing which you can adopt, which doesn't work in a complex environment we are living in, right?
Well, I mean, the Taylor's view of the world was based on a much simpler premise.
Yeah.
You know, a much simpler premise, and I think that I mean, I'm slightly biased on this, but I would say that one of the greatest things that leaders or managers and organizations can do is study systems thinking. Like really begin to understand the interconnectedness of things and try and figure out what they're optimizing for. I mean, Taylor is outdated in some industries. In some very kind of low level type work, it's still got its place, you know. But that's where we've now got robots doing most of that. But I think that, you know, I did some really interesting work with a large insurance company in the UK where we use systems thinking to design experiments and some group activities to help kind of bring to the surface some things. And one thing I did with them is that I've got a little a thing that I an exercise that I do to show what type of work is useful for a Taylorist approach and which type of work isn't. And it gets them to plot some of their major initiatives on this graph. And you get a leadership team together and you get them to try and plot them, and they all put different points because they've all got different ideas about what's going on. So I think the first step is making it transparent. The second step is then having someone who is their boss who's willing to basically ask them to change or leave their role. You know, and I think that for me, that's the key thing. Sometimes people don't sign up to these types of new organizations, and they just need to go and find someone they're going to be happier if you're really going to make the shift. And the consistent thing that I've experienced is is a consistent failure to move people into roles where they'll be better suited in an organization. I think, and that's one, and then it just sticks, and it's hard to change.
Yeah, actually, we keep saying that, right? Taylorism is out of date. It's not applicable in knowledge structure, but everyone who has seen the reporting structure, right? We have MEC structures, mutually exclusive, collectively exhaustive, which is kind of an outdated that when your organization design is kind of based on that, leading change becomes difficult.
But it's funny. I mean, this is one interesting thing. I've got a bit of free time in August if anybody wants to do this with me. But I think that sometimes the link that we draw between Taylorism and organizational hierarchies is a little bit flawed. Like, we will naturally create hierarchies, but it's more of an effort to understand something which is complex rather than a desire to control. The desire to control comes about from our egos, and I think historically in the world, men. Right? Men have got this terrible habit of designing these organizations, right? And I think we need more women involved in some strong positions, right? To basically get us into shape. But I think that if anybody wants to explore this seeming fait accompli, right? This idea that there's a link between hierarchy and Taylorism, I think that whilst they do go very well together, I don't think that actually they always have to. I think there are other ways of doing it.
Yeah, thank you, Ben. I think it would be a long discussion, and there are other people who have questions. We'll just stop it. But thank you for sharing your insight. Yeah, it was helpful.
And just to add into what Ben said about the organization, some of the organizations are not intended to be changed or can't change at all. Actually, it is very scientifically proven, and in the medical industry. So there was a study done which says that people prefer to die rather than changing their habits.
Yeah, if you're interested. Hold on, there's a great book called Changing for Good. I'll pop it in the chat. Now, the Changing for Good is basically a meta change framework. And what they did was these guys, Procrastin and De Clemente, went off and researched all the different kinds of psychological change, all different approaches to change, right? And they put it all together. And they come up with this lovely model they called a trans-theoretical model. But effectively, what it comes down to is you can categorize people into two early stages: the people who say I won't change and people who say I can't change. And if they say I won't change, there's not a lot you can do. It takes time and influence, and maybe they'll get there, maybe they won't. If people are saying I can't change, then that's a coaching opportunity. Right? And then there's some stages that you go through, and too often is that we get the I can'ts and we help them through, and we mistake the change for the result. The change is the beginning of the journey. Once you've changed, then there's maintenance. And you have to reach a point of maintenance where it reaches termination, where you're not going to flip back. And we forget this maintenance phase. Oh, great, they're doing these things now, we're done. But no, we're not. They've just started. And then the coaches leave and everyone else leaves, and everyone's left on their own. But we have to appreciate that there's a huge degree of maintenance that's required. And it takes years and years and years for some of these larger organizations to really shift.
Great. So we'll take one more question. So Pushpahas, if you want to unmute and ask.
Hey, hi Ben. This is really nice session, and I really like those connecting at L1 and L2 level and all the scientific principles behind that. I just have a very simple question for you, Ben. So assuming that you must have witnessed a situation. Let's say I'm talking about basically leaders where one practical maybe lessons learned maybe from your side in as part of the coaching exercise you would have basically learned that maybe something that you would have done and then you would have learned that this is not the right approach for me to basically to start the coach and coachee relationship with this executive, or I could have done it something differently. Any practical maybe just one example that you want to share?
How to start a coaching relationship with like a senior executive or something?
Yes.
Well,
any practical example, anecdote?
I was going to say, like, I did a webinar the other day, and someone said to me, and they didn't mean it in a bad way, but it sounded like it was a bit of a surprising question. It said, how many train wrecks do you have to have before you feel comfortable calling yourself an agile coach? And I was like, whoa, that feels like a very loaded question. I don't know, 6. I raised that because I think it's healthy to see yourself as having more failures and successes, right? Because it means you're always learning. I have found that talking about actual things I've done which I felt have succeeded. One, I've been fortunate because I've been a senior leader in organizations. I've been a director, I've been a senior vice president, and I've had those roles. So it means when I engage with people, there's a certain element of respect there. But I think being brutally honest and brief, right? Be very succinct with people. Have confidence in what you say and leave silence. Silence is people thinking, no matter what part of the organization they're in, no matter how senior they are, right? They're still trying their best. So I would listen. I would understand what's happened. I use systems thinking, kind of on the fly, to understand the connections between, and then just be very, very brief. I mean, one CTIO that I worked with, I think the first time I ever met him face to face, I just sat down, and he said to me, "So, what do you think the problems are?" I'm like, "You've got too many proxies. I said the distance between you and your people is too much. You don't know what's going on in your organization." Right, and that was, I was being brutally honest, and he just looked at me and he was quiet for about 10 seconds. Was like, "You're absolutely right. You're absolutely right. I've been thinking the same thing." It's great. So so then you're being paid for telling what they already think. And a lot of the time, senior leaders, when you say the right thing, they've already thought of it. And I think this is where there's a certain element of humility, right? Meet people where they are. Don't pretend that you know all the answers to all of their problems.
Yeah.
Actually listen to them and ask them questions. Right. And
I guess being honest is the key, isn't it? And as you mentioned, be brief and honest. Yeah. So thanks for that, Ben.
Oh, that's all right. Thank you.
I
wasn't being very concise then, was I? I'll shut up.
You were. Thanks, Ben. We really loved hearing you, and you did give us a lot of working to do. So we'll go from here. Please hang around, stay around. We'll love to have you here. Or you want to drop off, whatever works best for you.
I'll be here for a bit before my kids pull me away.
Awesome. Harshika, handing it over to you.
Thank